The protagonist of our story dreamed of living the life he had always wished for with his beloved. However, on a fateful day, everything he longed for was shattered, and she was killed. He then devoted his entire life to seeking revenge against the whole world. Just as he was on the verge of dominating the entire world, he was killed by one of the heroes. Yet, before his death, he cursed the hero's lineage. Ironically, 500 years later, our protagonist found himself reborn as a descendant of the very hero who killed him. What will he do in his new life, and will he be able to deal with the curse he himself cast? That is what we will discover in today's story. Our story begins with our protagonist, Simon, who took his beloved Katrina to the balcony of the place where they both worked. He pointed to Tillman Castle, which had stood for over 200 years, enduring countless wars without ever falling. Katrina, feeling uneasy, asked him to stop talking about such matters, insisting that their presence there might get them into trouble. Simon reassured her, saying no one would come at this hour, but she replied that she was busy finishing her cleaning tasks and had no time for this. He asked her to wait for just a minute, promising it wouldn't take long. The two gazed at the castle, and Simon mentioned that he simply wanted to show her the beauty of the castle at sunset, especially at this time of day. Katrina responded that it meant nothing to her, as people like them would never live on noble lands. Smiling, Simon told her there was a chance he could buy a house there soon, since he expected to be promoted to the rank of a mid-level sorcerer soon. He explained that he had written a paper about a new golem, which had impressed his mentors. They assured him that if the master acknowledged his work, he would receive the promotion. Katrina was taken aback, her face flushing as Simon continued, saying that while he couldn't afford a large house, it would be enough for the two of them. Then he asked her if she would marry him. Holding her hand, Simon told her she had endured so much for his sake, vowing to make her the happiest woman in the world from that day forward. But Katrina replied that they should postpone such talks until he actually received the promotion. Her response irritated Simon, who accused her of always discouraging him, though they ended up laughing together. Simon was elated, barely believing he was close to realizing his dreams. But things didn't go as Simon had hoped. The scene shifted to Simon standing in shock as he overheard the Duke praising the master, who had taken credit for Simon's research. At that moment, Simon realized that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough to achieve the life he dreamed of. Even giving his all wouldn't change anything. The second blow came when Simon heard the master make a specific request to the Duke. The Duke, surprised, asked if the master was certain, noting that the woman he requested came from a humble background. Just then, two guards entered, dragging the woman the master had demanded. Simon was horrified to see that it was Katrina, the love of his life, bearing clear signs of torture. The guards brought her to the master, who praised her beauty, while the Duke remarked that her life could have been entirely different had she been born into a higher class. At that moment, Simon began to lose control. A blue aura formed around his hand as he shouted at the master and the Duke, accusing them of destroying all his dreams out of sheer arrogance. He charged toward them in fury, demanding they stay away from Katrina. The Duke, enraged, saw Simon's audacity as deserving of severe punishment. Using his power, the Duke attacked Simon, who took the blow and fell from the top of the staircase. Katrina tried to reach him, but the guards held her back. Simon felt powerless as he fell, realizing he was too weak to save her. Time passed, and the scene transitioned to Simon confined in a dark cell, his only companions being a group of rats. His eyes were filled with despair, the signs of severe exhaustion evident, as he had lost all hope of changing his fate. Simon picked up a small rat inside the cell, when he suddenly heard the sound of a guard striking the cell door with a heavy spear, accompanied by another guard. The two began mocking him, remarking that Simon seemed desperate enough to eat the rat. One of them suggested that Simon should confess everything to the Duke and make things easier for himself, assuring him that if he revealed the method of summoning the golem, he would be freed immediately. Yet Simon remained silent, unmoving, as though their words weren't directed at him. The other guard laughed, saying Simon looked like he had lost his mind since the girl's death. The guards continued mocking him, pointing out that the beautiful girl who had taken her own life to remain loyal had made a foolish decision. Simon listened to their words without any expression on his face. Quietly, he placed the rat he had been holding back on the ground, silently apologizing to Katrina. Then, he bit his finger hard enough to draw blood. Meanwhile, one of the guards noticed that the rats in the cell were behaving unusually, in a way that was deeply unsettling. Suspicious, he stabbed one of the rats with his spear, only to be shocked as a red aura radiated from it, revealing a magical circle. The other guard, horrified, screamed, realizing they were in grave danger. At the same time, Simon began drawing a magical circle on the ground using his blood. One of the guards ran toward him, shouting for him to stop immediately. Simon, however, replied calmly, "I haven't done anything yet for you to stop me." Then, he placed his hand on the magical circle, activating all the magical symbols on the rats in the cell. Simon thought of Katrina, remembering the moment he lost her. He blamed himself for his weakness, convinced that had he been stronger, he would not have had to lose her. The magical aura grew, transforming into a dense darkness that filled the cell. Suddenly, a massive explosion shattered the cell wall. The rats transformed into enormous golem-like monsters. Simon stood firm, coldly commanding the creatures to eliminate the guards. Paralyzed by fear, the guards were unable to move or escape. At that moment, all Simon could think about was the question that had haunted him. Why am I still alive? The answer he reached was revenge. Revenge against the unjust world that had crushed his dreams and taken away his hope of living with the one he loved. Simon vowed never to be weak again, pledging to obtain every ounce of power he could. His expression shifted into a crazed smile as he swore to change everything. The scene shifted to the Duke's palace, where the Duke was stunned as Simon stormed in, riding one of the monstrous golems he had created. The Duke shouted in fury, accusing Simon of losing his mind by resorting to dark magic, and demanded to know how someone who once served the Heavenly Order could sell his soul to demons. Simon replied coldly, "And what will you do about it?" At that moment, the master entered the hall, falling to his knees before Simon and begging for mercy. The master offered to make Simon the leader of the institution, swearing eternal loyalty and promising to do anything Simon asked. Simon's face twisted with rage upon hearing the offer. Before delivering a fatal blow to the master, he mockingly asked, "Can you bring back the dead?" Without hesitation, Simon struck him down and destroyed the palace entirely. He stood atop the ruins, vowing to Katrina's memory that he would destroy this filthy world entirely. The scene transitioned to a later time, where the Emperor was seen summoning the legendary knight Lacan to save the world from the darkness that had engulfed it. The Emperor explained that the Demon King's army had seized the heavenly kingdoms, committed massacres against innocents, and already destroyed 2 kingdoms and a duchy. The world stood on the brink of ruin, and the Emperor pleaded with Lacan to save them, declaring that the fate of the world now rested in his hands. Lacan gathered an army of warriors, preparing to march against the Demon King. Before their departure, he addressed his troops, reminding them that as the brave warriors of the heavenly kingdom of Artenia, they carried the responsibility of being the last ray of hope for the faltering empire. He urged them to stand firm against the shadows devouring the continent of Ludasia, calling on them to fight for their families and for the world they lived in. Raising his sword high, Lacan declared that this day would be the day they vanquished the Demon King and saved the world from destruction. The scene shifted to a flashback, where Katrina was seen speaking with Simon about the news of a child who had his hand cut off for stealing a loaf of bread. She was furious, saying the nobles had gone too far with their punishment, because they could never understand what hunger felt like. Simon cautioned her to lower her voice, warning that someone might overhear, but she stood firm in her view. She explained that what happened to the child was the result of the rigid class system they were born into, expressing her frustration over the injustice of a world where one's social class was determined at birth. Simon smiled and told her that a day would come when class distinctions would vanish and everyone would enjoy equal rights. Katrina interrupted him, saying that such a day would not come through mere waiting, prompting Simon to ask what they should do instead. She replied that they must become the change they wished to see in the world, or else their future children would suffer the same struggles they had endured. Her words shocked Simon, causing him to drop the books he was carrying. Embarrassed, he muttered that they weren't even married yet. Katrina laughed, urging him to focus on what she had said instead of avoiding the subject. Seeing his reaction, she asked if he had no intention of marrying her. Flustered, Simon assured her he would, bending down to gather the fallen books. Smiling, Katrina added that she thought he was terribly awkward and shy, making her the only person who could ever marry him. The scene returned to the present, where Simon stood before his dark, foreboding fortress. Remembering Katrina, he murmured to himself that the end was near, and that the world they had dreamed of was finally within reach. Standing before him was the army of warriors led by Lacan, who shouted that the world had suffered enough because of Simon's actions, but today would mark the end of it all. Lacan pointed his sword at Simon, vowing in the name of justice to hold him accountable for all the crimes he had committed. Simon smirked, then burst into loud laughter, taunting Lacan. He asked if Lacan was confident in fulfilling his promises, then began channeling his magical power, challenging him to try. Lacan responded with fury, declaring that he was not alone. Countless heroes of the Empire stood with him, all ready to settle the score. Raising his voice, Lacan addressed his soldiers, proclaiming that this day would mark the end of the Demon King and the restoration of peace to the world. The soldiers charged toward Simon, with Lacan leading the front. As they approached, Simon mocked them, asking, "Who do you think you are to judge me?" He added that it would be he who would pass judgment. Slamming his magical staff into the ground, he activated a massive magic circle, declaring that justice had died the day he lost Katrina, and that he no longer believed in the illusion of justice. The soldiers felt a surge of terror as they realized the immense and dark aura emanating from Simon, its power overwhelming and ominous, leaving them doubting their ability to confront him. Simon declared to his opponents that he would now show them the only thing he believed in: power. The magical aura he had unleashed began to take shape, forming into massive golem-like monsters. With a calm smile, Simon turned to Lacan and stated that this day would mark the birth of a new kind of justice, entirely different from his opponent's illusions. The sight of the enormous creatures struck fear into the hearts of the soldiers, who stood frozen in disbelief as Simon proudly proclaimed that this day would be the beginning of a new era. The colossal monsters charged mercilessly at the soldiers. One soldier, paralyzed with fear at the sheer number of golems, couldn't move until a comrade shouted at him, trying to bring him back to his senses and stressing that the future of the world depended on their resilience in this moment. Simon watched the scene with scorn, commenting that these soldiers were nothing but fools, adding that true power determined fate, and the social status they once boasted of had become meaningless. At that moment, Simon felt he was on the verge of achieving his goal and gaining full control over the world, but a voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts. It was Lacan, charging toward him with determination, declaring that he would never forgive Simon for his actions. Lacan struck a powerful blow against one of the massive golems, asserting that he would put an end to Simon's evil deeds once and for all. The attack shocked Simon, who hadn't expected his opponent to defeat one of his strongest creations so easily. In that moment, Simon realized the true reason for his failure to subjugate the kingdom of Levia, despite his repeated efforts. Simon and Lacan exchanged looks of defiance, each declaring that the other would meet their end here today. The battle raged on for a long time as the soldiers fought against the golem creatures, while Simon and Lacan engaged in an intense one-on-one duel. After a prolonged struggle, exhaustion became evident on Lacan, who leaned on his sword, panting heavily. Yet, he turned toward Simon and declared firmly that it was all over. At that moment, the last remaining golem behind Simon collapsed. Lacan saw this as an opportunity to make his final move, ready to deliver the decisive blow. However, he froze when he noticed tears streaming down Simon's face. Simon calmly admitted that he knew the world was a vile place, adding that if not for Lacan's intervention, he would have started everything anew after destroying the world completely. Simon's expression shifted into one of intense fury as he cursed Lacan's descendants, wishing them eternal suffering. Without hesitation, Lacan delivered a powerful strike with his sword, severing Simon's head and ending the battle with his victory. In his final moments, Simon's mind was flooded with memories of his happy times with Katrina, as though she were standing before him, speaking to him once more. However, those memories abruptly faded as he opened his eyes to find himself awake. Confused, he began questioning whether what he had seen was merely a dream. His bewilderment deepened when he realized he was still alive despite having lost his head. He felt only a slight dizziness, and when he looked at his hands, there were no signs of any wounds, adding to his confusion. Simon began examining the room he found himself in, but it appeared unfamiliar and strange. He wondered if he had been transported to a foreign land. Simon was unable to comprehend how he had survived death, especially since even the most potent forms of dark magic could not bring the dead back to life. While inspecting the room, his attention was drawn to a painting hanging on the wall. Upon seeing it, a surge of anger overwhelmed him, for the painting depicted Lacan, the man responsible for his demise. He couldn't understand why Lacan's image would be present in this place. At that moment, a servant entered the room, his face beaming with joy, addressing Simon as young master. The servant rushed to embrace him warmly, expressing immense relief and happiness at his return to consciousness after being in a coma for a week. Simon interrupted the servant's enthusiasm with a sharp question about why he was being addressed as young master, leaving the servant astonished and concerned. The servant asked if Simon was unaware of his own identity. Realizing that Simon might be suffering from temporary amnesia due to the accident, the servant attempted to reassure him and explain the situation. He informed Simon that his true name was Luc Lacan, heir to the Lacan province in the Baroque Empire, and a descendant of the great hero, Lacan. Simon, now in a new body, was stunned by the truth he had just heard. He still couldn't grasp the fact that Lacan had died 500 years ago, which meant he had been reincarnated into the future. However, it was in the worst possible way. He had become Lacan's descendant 500 years later. Feeling disoriented, Simon struggled to organize his thoughts in this unfamiliar situation. Suddenly, the servant was startled by Simon's abrupt movement, and alarmed, warned him not to act so recklessly, especially since he had only just recovered and regained consciousness. Yet Simon remained unconvinced of the reality before him, unwilling or unable to accept the truth. He rushed to the door, determined to confirm it for himself. As soon as he opened the door leading outside, Simon froze. He stood there, stunned and unable to believe what his eyes were seeing. It all felt meaningless to him. What lay before him appeared like something out of a dream, beyond what his mind, still rooted in the knowledge of the past, could comprehend. Standing before him was a massive ironclad structure, something his mind could not process or accept as natural. Simon stared in awe at the armor, and asked about the nature of the thing before him. At that moment, he began to believe the servant's earlier words, especially now that something this intricate and advanced stood in front of him. Simon gazed at the armor, marveling at its complexity. He realized that this weapon was far more advanced than any ordinary golem magic. He felt a sense of wonder, as he had never imagined that such magic, something he had always dreamed of, could become a reality and stand before him. At that moment, the servant, Hans, joined him on the balcony, prompting Simon to ask his name again. Hans replied that his name was Hans, and that he was Simon's personal servant, entirely at his command. Simon asked Hans to explain the nature of the entity standing before them, and Hans took a moment to collect his thoughts before answering. He informed Simon that the giant entity was called a gigant, a bipedal human weapon. Simon curiously asked if the weapon was created using golem magic, and Hans replied that Simon was partially correct. The gigant was developed using specialized scientific techniques alongside magic. Hans explained that thanks to advanced technology, the gigant, unlike golems that are remotely controlled, is operated internally by a pilot. Simon was taken aback and asked Hans how a person could enter and control such a massive entity. Hans assured him that it was indeed a real and astounding invention. Simon remained in awe, pondering how such a creation required someone with advanced technological knowledge to operate it from within. However, he realized that if Hans was entirely truthful and hiding nothing, then this weapon was indeed a remarkable and ingenious invention. It offered complete protection to its operator from the dangers of the battlefield and responded more quickly to events compared to golems controlled remotely. Thus, the weapon appeared entirely free of the flaws and limitations Simon had faced when using golems. Simon continued to sink into deep thought as Hans observed him, unable to discern exactly what was running through his mind. Simon abruptly left the balcony, leaving Hans alone, as he became immersed in thoughts about the great gigant weapon. While diving into his enthusiastic musings about the advanced technology of this world, he suddenly realized that the existence of this weapon confirmed that 500 years had indeed passed. What puzzled him more was why he had been reincarnated as a descendant of his greatest enemy's family. Simon walked into the study and did something unusual. He began drinking heavily, in a manner unbecoming of a nobleman, and without any warning. Hans tried to stop him and calm him down, attempting to convince him that his actions were wrong and harmful to his health. Yet Simon completely ignored him, continuing to drink, irritated by Hans's interference and remarks. Angrily, Simon reminded Hans that he had just told him he was a descendant of the Lacan family. Hans, flustered, confirmed this to be true, to which Simon retorted that he was supposed to be stronger and healthier than most people, and that there was no need for concern. However, as Simon spoke, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain and collapsed, prompting Hans to rush to his aid. Simon experienced intense dizziness, as if the ground was spinning beneath him, and found himself unable to stand again. He was left stunned and confused, unable to comprehend what had happened to him, especially since he hadn't drunk enough to collapse like this. Hans reminded him that he had warned him not to overexert himself in such a manner, pointing out that he needed to be more cautious because of the curse that afflicted him. Shocked and frightened, Simon demanded to know from Hans what curse he was talking about. Hans, though slightly embarrassed, wasn't entirely surprised. He had anticipated that his new master might suffer from complete memory loss. Pressed again by Simon to explain the curse, Hans began recounting the story, unsure of where to start. He narrated the tale from the beginning, describing how Lacan had gathered an army to defeat the demon lord, who sought to destroy everything. After a fierce battle, Lacan brought peace to the world. Simon interrupted, asking Hans to skip the details and get straight to the point. Hans resumed, explaining that despite the praise Lacan received for saving the world, he died immediately after the battle, due to a curse cast upon him by the demon lord. Simon was taken aback by this revelation, especially since he didn't remember casting such a curse on Lacan. Simon went to the library to research the historical accounts of the event. He discovered that his true lineage traced back to the demon lord, who had wielded dark magic to create golems, stronger weapons than any army or technology. He read about the demon lord's ability to annihilate thousands of soldiers with a single gesture, which had brought him close to achieving total domination of the world. However, the world found peace thanks to a righteous warrior who confronted and thwarted the demon lord's plans. Yet, before his death, the demon lord cursed the warrior, ensuring that Lacan and all his descendants would meet tragic ends at a young age. Simon felt frustration as he read through the accounts in the books, which seemed written to portray him solely as a villain, without presenting the facts fairly. He grew more upset because he knew well that he had never cast any curse on the warrior Lacan. He reassured himself that no spell, cursed or otherwise, could remain effective for such a long period. Nevertheless, he felt a pang of guilt, considering that his defeat at Lacan's hands was the root cause of the current situation. Simon bitterly reflected on the fact that he had been reborn as the grandson of his greatest enemy, feeling an intense rage and unable to find any justification for this fate. To him, it felt as though he were the one cursed, not the other way around. Determined to learn more about this world, he pulled another book from the library, intent on uncovering every detail he could, especially since he saw this second chance as an opportunity to accomplish what he had failed to achieve in his past life. Facing Katerina again under these circumstances was unacceptable to him. Simon knew that the world, which had remained steeped in corruption and injustice for 500 years after his defeat, had only grown more rotten. Despite the passage of time, he refused to believe that all of his loyal followers had disappeared completely. He resolved to begin gathering information about this era to reunite his forces and reclaim his followers, using this opportunity to achieve what had been beyond his grasp in his previous life. The night passed as Simon immersed himself in his work, trying to understand everything about this new world. The effort left him utterly exhausted, as trying to grasp the changes that had occurred over 500 years in a single night was nearly impossible. Adding to the challenge was the mystery surrounding the fate of his followers, who had been lost to him for centuries. He had no idea where they were, nor did they know he had returned. Furthermore, Simon grew increasingly frustrated by the fact that the people of this era seemed to have completely forgotten the existence of the Demon King, as though any trace of him had been utterly erased from history. To Simon, this was illogical, even after 500 years. His frustration was compounded by his current physical weakness. His new body lacked magical power or any endurance, rendering him useless for any of his plans. As Simon walked with heavy steps, his ankle twisted, and he fell violently to the ground. He remained there, unable to rise, lost in thought about what he could do in this wretched situation. He felt utterly powerless, as if he were the one truly cursed to exist in this absurd and unjust world. Simon sorrowfully recalled Katerina, realizing that he had no information about her or her fate in this world. He addressed her in his mind, wondering if he could be considered a failure, for having accomplished nothing of note in his life, neither avenging her nor achieving his goals, with all his plans ending in failure. His only dream had been to create a world where everyone could live equally, free from oppression and injustice. But his grim thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a loud and angry voice calling out to him. Simon turned toward the balcony door, from which the voice came, and moved toward its source, wondering what all the commotion was about. Another voice responded, chastising him for continuing to avoid facing them. Simon found a group of palace servants in a state of panic as they listened to the angry shouts of people outside. Among them was the head of the Merchant Guild branch, a man known as Darren, who was leading the protest. Simon discovered that debts had piled up on Lacan and his lineage. Darren shouted furiously, declaring that Simon owed them 30,000 pesos, a sum borrowed last year under the pretext of establishing a mine. Darren added that Simon had been avoiding them ever since, and clearly had no intention of repaying his debts. The situation escalated as Lord Delane expressed his own anger, asserting that the situation had become utterly intolerable. Hans calmly responded to Lord Delane, explaining that young Master Lacan needed to remain at rest due to his health conditions, and that they would attempt to find a way to repay the debt at a later time, suggesting a more suitable appointment. However, Lord Delane interrupted him stubbornly, insisting that they would not leave until they heard directly from young Master Lacan himself. Tension and anxiety spread among the servants in the mansion, prompting Delane to speak sharply, pointing out that their obvious reactions indicated they were neither prepared nor capable of paying now. He added that 30,000 pesos was no small amount, and presented an alternative offer, handing over the massive gigant stationed in the mansion as compensation. He justified this by claiming its actual value might be less than the debt since it was used, but he deemed the offer fair and reasonable. The knight Roger intervened angrily, vehemently rejecting the proposal and declaring it impossible to part with any of the 3 giants in the mansion. Roger justified his stance by emphasizing that they would be unable to defend themselves in case of an attack, insisting that giving up the gigant was out of the question. He added that Delane would have to kill him first before touching any of the gigants. The accountant, Dixon, tried to calm Roger, suggesting there was no need to escalate the situation and proposing a temporary solution of increasing taxes for a certain period. However, Hans strongly opposed this, stating that the people were already suffering enough and that it was unjust to burden them further to repay the debt. Dixon countered, arguing that if taxes were ruled out, the only option left was to hand over the gigant. Roger grew furious again, vowing to prevent this even at the cost of his life. The situation escalated as the 3 argued heatedly, while Simon observed the scene with a smirk, before bursting into laughter at the state of the once proud Lochan family. He called for everyone to stop arguing and calm down. Lord Delane spoke again, openly admitting his desire to acquire the gigant and the mansion itself, but claiming that he didn't want it to appear as though he was taking something by force from the noble Lochan household. Therefore, he proposed a new suggestion, relinquishing the magical tower situated behind the gigant in the courtyard. Delane's words left everyone stunned. Knight Roger, servant Hans, and accountant Dixon were all taken aback by the mention of the magical tower. Roger began thinking aloud, suggesting that giving up the magical tower might be a better option than parting with the gigant. Hans agreed, noting that the magical tower was currently unused by anyone. Dixon added that the tower had previously been used as a tourist attraction to generate some revenue, but was now practically worthless. Simon, who had been silently observing, was deeply surprised by the mention of the magical tower. He realized that this tower was not just any ordinary structure, but was, in fact, his own tower from his past life. The magical tower he had used frequently, 500,000 years ago, in the region where the Demon King's magical tower now stands. Simon's hometown was far away from that tower. It was an old, dilapidated town, but Simon found happiness there because Katrina was by his side, and he had no worries. That wretched land was a place of comfort for the two of them, where they shared dreams about the future. Simon felt intense anger as he realized that the land he once dreamed of with Katrina was now being bought and sold so easily. As Lord Delane continued speaking, he reassured accountant Dixon not to worry, pointing out that the diverse capabilities of their trading company would allow them to transform the area and the tower into a popular tourist destination, significantly boosting the nation's economy. The knight said nothing, but accountant Dixon expressed his admiration for the idea and asked Delane where he should sign. Suddenly, everyone felt an overwhelming pressure and a sense of impending danger. It was caused by Simon's anger, as he took the matter personally. Hans asked Simon why he had come down and whether he was feeling all right. Simon responded in a chilling, terrifying tone, ordering everyone to step aside. Delane noticed that young Master Lacan had finally appeared and commented that they had waited a long time to meet him. He asked if Simon had fully recovered, adding that the negotiations with his subordinates were going well, and all that remained was his signature to confirm that their company would take over the Demon King's tower. Simon responded angrily, saying that talking seemed to be the only thing Delane was good at, and asked him if he understood the significance and nature of the place he was discussing. Simon continued, his tone growing sharper, addressing Delane with disdain and questioning how he dared to demand ownership of such a place. Delane was terrified by Simon's tone, unable to believe how this man, rumored to be gentle and weak, now appeared with blazing, furious eyes. Delane tried to reply, saying that they had been considerate of Simon's position, but Simon interrupted him, stating that a fraud like him had no right to continue speaking. Simon added that their plan to seize the land surrounding their main properties was clearly aimed at expanding their influence and power under the guise of developing the area, which would allow people to freely enter under the pretense of tourism. Delane was left speechless, and Simon asked if anything he had said was incorrect. Simon went on, mocking them, saying they were so pathetic that they couldn't even sell their used weapons, yet they were attempting to impose their control over the property and lands of others. Simon's tone grew sharper, expressing his disdain for incompetent individuals like them, who presented themselves as angelic, but were worse than demons. Delane grew angry, feeling that he couldn't allow Simon to dominate the conversation like this, and thinking he needed to respond with a stronger retort. Delane shouted that the Lacan family was unable to repay the debt, which was why they had tried to be sympathetic toward him. He insisted that they had offered him a fair proposal, and that their company needed to find a way to recover its funds. Simon replied in a calm yet confident and cunning tone, "Who said we weren't repaying our debts? Within 15 days or less, we will repay all our debts, including the interest." He then raised his voice in a menacing tone, ordering Delane to leave his property and land immediately, threatening that he would not allow him to appear there again. Delane, trembling from Simon's threatening demeanor, felt the seriousness of his dark intentions, and left the premises at once, attempting to appear as though he was withdrawing of his own will, sarcastically remarking that they would soon see if Simon kept his word. Simon gave him a disgusted look and muttered, "People like him all behave the same way." At that moment, Knight Roger, visibly moved, spoke to Simon, saying he couldn't believe what Simon had said to Lord Delane. Simon stared at Roger in confusion, unsure of what would happen next. Suddenly, Knight Roger, servant Hans, and accountant Dixon, all followers of young Master Lacan, stood and saluted him. They all spoke in unison, expressing their admiration for his speech and his words during the confrontation with Lord Delane. Hans commented that Simon had demonstrated sharp insight, revealing Delane's future plans. Roger added that seeing Simon's fierce anger in defense of his ancestors' property, achievements, and honor was an unforgettable sight for him. Simon looked at them with bewilderment and irritation, questioning the nonsense they were talking about. Roger replied, saying he had never imagined that his master bore so much pride and honor for the family's legacy, and that he had seen firsthand how the opportunistic merchant was rendered powerless in the face of Simon's sharp and devastating responses. Roger added that, in that moment, he saw an image of the great warrior Lacan, Simon's ancestor. This enraged Simon, who despised being compared to his sworn enemy, Lacan. He felt as though these people were trying to turn him back into the Demon King, as if they were inviting their own ruin. Hans approached Simon politely, and asked if he might know how the young master intended to repay the debt. Simon responded with a question. What is the current value of 30,000 pesos? Hans explained that 10,000 pesos could buy a sack of wheat, which was also the same price as a single unit of the new warrior-class gigant. However, he added that, at the moment, they lacked sufficient collateral to borrow from banks or other merchants, meaning they needed alternative solutions. Simon replied sharply, saying that such talk was useless, and, if that was all Hans had, he should step aside. Simon left, declaring that he would handle the debt repayment his own way, and that all they needed to do was stand back and watch. Simon re-entered the mansion, heading toward the study, which was filled with cobwebs, its walls crumbling and the ceiling nearly collapsing, resembling an abandoned house. Even the furniture was in a poor state, and the sparse belongings were of low quality, unbefitting the place's reputation. Simon grew furious, throwing all the papers on the desk in frustration, and said to Hans, "How could this place belong to the descendants of the Demon King's killers? Why is there nothing of value here?" He accused Hans of having certainly looted the place and its belongings. Hans stammered in shock, replying, "It's impossible that we would have done such a thing. How could you think of us this way?" He added that if Simon reviewed the family's lineage, everything would become clear. Simon, surprised by Hans's response, dismissed the idea, stating he had no intention of reviewing or looking into such matters. Hans began explaining, recounting how, after the great hero Lacan defeated the Demon King, he was granted the title of Marquis and a vast expanse of land south of the kingdom of Levia. Simon listened intently, waiting to understand how the situation had reached its current state. Hans continued, explaining that during that time, Duke Barak incited a rebellion against the kingdom of Levia, forcing Viscount Lacan to confront him in the name of justice. However, under the lingering influence of the Demon King's curse, the Viscount suffered a devastating defeat and lost everything. His title was revoked, and he was exiled beyond the kingdom's borders, where his health rapidly deteriorated, leading to his untimely death. Simon began to realize that Lacan had never intended to build his estate and legacy in this location. Nonetheless, he pressed Hans with sharp questions, demanding to know why the family had fallen into such dire financial straits. He questioned how they had managed to maintain the household for 500 years, only to end up in this deplorable state. Hans explained that the family's ancestors had always hoped to reclaim their former glory. Surprised, Simon asked Hans what he meant by this. Hans elaborated, explaining that the ancestors were willing to sacrifice everything, assets, power, and influence, in their attempts to restore the family's reputation. However, due to the generational curse passed down through the family, no matter how hard they worked, their efforts always came to nothing. Thus, the family, once home to the hero who saved the world, eventually crumbled under the weight of their ambitions and misfortunes. Hans added that Simon might recall why he had been unconscious for over half a month. It was due to a recent major incident. Simon had been tirelessly working to restore the family's honor, pushing himself to the limits to prove he was worthy of the title of a hero, only to collapse from exhaustion. Growing tired of Hans's explanations, Simon stood from his chair and walked toward the window. Hans, shocked by his master's reaction, hesitated as Simon bluntly stated that Hans's words suggested there was nothing they could do to improve their current situation. Hans apologized profusely, admitting that even as the head servant of the family, he had no solutions to offer. Suddenly, Hans spoke impulsively, declaring that he was certain there was still something they could do, and if necessary, he would sacrifice his own life to gather the full amount of the debt. Simon responded calmly, saying, "That won't be necessary. I already have an idea." His eyes gleamed with malice as he stated that they now only needed to find a way to repay the debt, whatever it took. The next morning, the household awoke to screams of shock and confusion. Hans realized that what his young master had meant by finding a way to repay the debt was far more literal than he had expected. Knight Roger collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the sight before him, questioning aloud how something like this could have happened. Hans remained in a state of shock and fear, unable to believe what had happened in the mansion's courtyard. He discovered that the object his master had chosen to use to repay the debt was the statue of his ancestor, the great hero Lacan. The servants and workers in the mansion were filled with sorrow and disbelief, utterly shaken by what they had seen. No one could figure out when this had happened, as the statue was still in its place the previous night. How could it have been moved in just one night? However, Hans was more focused on finding the young master than on solving the mystery of the statue's disappearance. At that moment, a guard approached Hans to inform him of another major problem. Hans, frustrated, replied that this was not the time to discuss additional issues, and that finding the young master was their top priority. The guard then revealed that young Master Lacan had left the mansion during a lapse in security. Hans collapsed to the ground in frustration, overwhelmed by the dire circumstances they were facing, and cried out in despair, wondering what plan his young master could possibly be scheming now. Meanwhile, Simon was riding in a carriage toward his destination, taking a short nap. The driver woke him up, requesting permission to ask a question if it wasn't too intrusive. Simon, half asleep, told him to go ahead, but first asked the driver to remind him of his name. The driver chuckled lightly and asked how Simon could possibly forget, then introduced himself as Philip, his personal knight and escort. Philip hesitated before asking if Simon was truly serious about selling the statue. Simon, with an air of seriousness, affirmed his decision, explaining that the statue could fetch a high price if sold properly. Philip, still uneasy, pointed out that the statue was a historic artifact, over 5 centuries old. Simon responded dismissively, sarcastically questioning if those 5 centuries could provide him with food and drink. Philip added that even if the statue were sold, it wouldn't be enough to repay the entire debt. Simon assured him that selling the statue was only one part of his broader plan. Philip chuckled awkwardly, saying that as long as Simon had a plan, people might understand the situation if he managed to repay the debt. He then politely asked Simon to explain the details of this plan. Simon nonchalantly revealed that he intended to use the money from selling the statue to gamble, allowing him to earn the 30,000 pesos needed. Philip was stunned and protested, asking how Simon could move forward with such a reckless plan. He questioned what Simon would do if he lost the money in one of his bets instead of winning. Simon retorted sharply, wondering why Philip was accompanying him if his intent was to lecture him on morality the entire way. Philip, now agitated, replied that he had been forced to join Simon at dawn without knowing the details of the plan. He insisted that had he known what Simon was planning, he would never have agreed to assist him. Philip then pleaded, visibly flustered, for them to turn back, seek forgiveness, and come up with an alternative strategy. Simon, in a cold and disdainful tone, dismissed Philip as both cowardly and foolish. He added that if they returned now, Simon would have to explain why he left with the statue of the great ancestor. He further clarified that if people learned the reason was his need for money to gamble, they would never forgive him for such actions. There was a strong likelihood that Philip would face expulsion from the household and exile if they returned now, as it was unlikely that such a measure would be taken against the young master himself. This meant that the punishment would inevitably fall on Philip, his personal guard. Philip felt an overwhelming sense of fear and anxiety at the prospect of expulsion and the severe accusations that would follow, knowing that no one would show him mercy. Simon cunningly urged Philip to choose wisely, subtly implying what would be best for him. He asked if Philip preferred to end up homeless and penniless, or to be remembered as a symbol of honor and pride for the household. Under immense psychological pressure, Philip found himself unable to argue with Simon's words, and reluctantly agreed to continue the journey. Simon expressed his satisfaction, praising Philip for making the right decision, and then instructed him to move quickly, noting that they had wasted enough time. As Philip guided the carriage forward, he reflected on the rumors he had heard about his master's personality shift after waking from his coma. The stories, he realized, were entirely true, though the transformation was far greater than he had expected. Simon had become a far more sinister and malevolent figure. They arrived at a port just in time to board a ship, catching it 5 minutes before departure. Philip, still uneasy about the plan, hesitated, and asked Simon if they were truly going through with it and boarding the ship. Simon responded slyly, asking if Philip thought it would be better to return instead. Realizing he had no real choice, Philip forced a strained laugh and remarked that they should board before it was too late. They stepped onto the ship, becoming the last passengers to board. The ship departed immediately, setting course for their destination. After some time, they arrived at the port city of Lineage, which dazzled them with its stunning nighttime lights and breathtaking coastal scenery. Simon achieved the first step of his plan by successfully selling the statue and securing a substantial amount of money. However, Philip attempted to negotiate with the merchant for a higher price, emphasizing that the statue belonged to the greatest warrior of the Lacan lineage, and that the offered sum was far too low compared to its value. The merchant replied curtly, stating he could only pay more if he were willing to declare bankruptcy. Simon, growing bored with the negotiation, called out to Philip, instructing him to continue guiding him through the city, given his familiarity with the area. Philip complied, leading Simon toward their next destination, a gambling hall. On the way, Philip voiced his frustration, remarking that they could have secured a much higher price from the merchant. Simon dismissed the comment, stating that the amount they had received was sufficient as a starting point. Simon then commented on how much the place had changed since his last visit, prompting Philip to ask if he had been to the city before. Simon replied that he had visited briefly a long time ago, though it had looked nothing like this at the time. Internally, Simon recalled that in the past, they had been unable to approach the area because of the kraken that had made the nearby island its home. Observing the stark differences, Simon realized how much time had altered the place, and noted that the residents seemed to have completely forgotten their history. Simon remarked to Philip that coming to this place had been an excellent decision, a statement that pleased Philip, who took it as a rare compliment from his master. Philip thanked the young master for his kind words, adding that although he didn't know when Simon had previously visited the city, it was clear that it had undergone dramatic changes. He explained that Lineage was the second largest city in the southern region of the empire, which accounted for its constant and significant transformations. Philip told Simon that the area had originally been an isolated island, difficult to access due to sea monsters like the kraken, but with the development of magical engineering and advanced weaponry, the location grew in popularity thanks to its stunning scenery, eventually transforming into a renowned destination. As a result, gambling establishments proliferated throughout the city, prompting Philip to ask his young master if he was truly certain about his decision. Simon confidently replied that if he weren't 100% sure, he wouldn't have come here in the first place. When they arrived at the venue where the plan would be executed, Simon declared that it was time to begin. Philip tried to persuade him to reconsider, but Simon refused and insisted on entering immediately. Philip urged Simon to take a breath and calm down, but Simon mocked him, asking why he was so nervous and afraid. Philip, breathing heavily, questioned how Simon could remain so composed and whether he had a solid plan to win the games. Simon responded proudly, explaining that gambling was all about confidence and maintaining the right attitude in front of opponents. After some time, Simon began executing his plan and entered the casino to play cards. However, things didn't go as expected, and he lost every round. One of his opponents eventually asked, after yet another defeat, if Simon intended to continue or would finally accept his losses. The opponent added smugly that luck seemed to be on his side today. Simon replied, stating that skill was also a part of luck. The man laughed, commenting on Simon's generosity and saying it was an honor to play with such a remarkable young man. However, he added that it seemed Simon was running out of chips and that it might be time to end the game. Simon interrupted, instructing Philip to convert all their remaining money into chips immediately. Philip was shocked and objected, warning that losing everything would be disastrous. Simon, however, shouted at him to obey without argument. The man laughed again, noting that Simon seemed very flustered, and remarked that today was indeed his lucky day to be up against such a reckless youth. With enthusiasm, the man declared that he would bet everything he had this time. After converting the money into chips, Simon announced that he too would wager everything he had. Philip, filled with despair, feared that the family's already tarnished reputation would crumble even further. The man was taken aback by Simon's boldness, and admitted that he felt nervous, as this was the first time he had played a game of such high stakes. He noted, however, that Simon appeared unusually calm. Simon replied that worrying wouldn't change the outcome, frustrating the man, who called Simon's words discouraging. The man then declared it was time for both of them to reveal their hands and determine the winner. The man flipped his cards over and jumped with excitement, revealing 3 eights. He felt on top of the world, convinced that no one could beat him today. The man began gathering the chips he had won, paying no attention to Simon, stating that he was obliged to take all the winnings this time. However, Simon interrupted him, saying, "Wait, you need to see my cards before declaring the result." Simon flipped his cards, revealing an astonishingly superior hand, far better than his opponent's. The man was utterly shocked and reacted with disbelief, shouting that it was impossible and illogical. Simon, maintaining his composure, replied confidently that the thrill of gambling lay in its unexpected outcomes, and remarked that the game had been thoroughly enjoyable. Philip, overwhelmed with relief and joy, couldn't hold back his tears, which now flowed from happiness rather than anxiety. Yet, the man remained furious, refusing to believe that things could turn around so drastically. He accused Simon of cheating during the game. Simon, calm as ever, asked if the man was suggesting that Simon had people secretly signaling him about his opponent's cards. The man was stunned, unable to comprehend how Simon had uncovered such a carefully orchestrated trick. Meanwhile, Simon silently mused that the fool truly believed he could deceive him with such a cheap ploy. Simon revealed that he had noticed from the start that the spectators near the gambling table were the man's accomplices, secretly passing him cards. Simon explained that he had deliberately allowed things to play out that way because he needed to handle all the cards first. By doing so, he had left tiny traces of his mana on the cards, enabling him to control them. For someone who had once commanded an army of monsters with his magic, altering cards was a trivial matter. Speaking calmly, Simon asked his opponent to admit defeat. The man, enraged, declared that the game was over for the day and ordered his men to teach this young master a lesson in manners. Strong men armed with sharp weapons appeared and advanced toward Simon. Simon, still calm outwardly but seething internally, thought to himself that scoundrels like these hadn't changed even after 500 years. He added that although he no longer possessed the vast mana reserves he once did, he had enough to handle vermin like them. Standing up from his chair, Simon prepared to confront the approaching thugs. At that moment, Philip, unable to abandon his young master, quickly drew his sword and rushed to defend him. With skillful strikes, Philip began attacking the thugs, shouting, "How dare you raise your swords against the sole heir of the Lacan family?" He added that their actions showed they were fully prepared to put their lives on the line to atone for their unforgivable mistake. The man, now fearful of Philip's intimidating aura, grew visibly anxious and unsettled by the clear threat. With a trembling voice and Philip's sword pointed at him, the man admitted to committing an unforgivable crime and stated that he deserved to die for it. Philip yelled at him to remain silent, declaring that he had no right to speak after attempting to harm the young master. Simon listened to Philip's words, pleased with how the situation had developed unexpectedly, and decided to use it to his advantage. After resolving the matter successfully and signing the necessary documents, Simon and Philip departed, with Philip carrying a heavy bag filled with money. Philip remarked that the amount inside must be over 10,000 pesos. Simon confirmed this but was preoccupied with another thought, noticing that Philip had proven to be far more capable than he initially assumed, having regarded him as little more than a helper or porter. Simon reflected on the profits they had made, concluding that while it wasn't a bad haul for the day, it would be challenging to use gambling establishments again after the chaos they caused. He asked Philip if he knew of any other places where they could make significant earnings without relying on gambling. Philip pondered for a moment before suggesting the Gigant Arena. Curious, Simon inquired about the nature of the arena, prompting Philip to explain that it was similar to traditional combat arenas once used by humans, but now dedicated to gigants. The profits depended on the outcomes of each round, and if managed wisely, they could make 30,000 pesos or more. Simon considered the idea and seemed intrigued, particularly since the concept of gigants had always fascinated him. If the gigants were controlled by golem magic, it might even be possible to predict the winners. Philip assured Simon that he could trust him, mentioning that he had been a top student at the Imperial Military Academy specializing in gigants and giants. Simon instructed Philip to lead the way to the arena. Philip, excited, jokingly requested an extra reward for his service. On their way to the arena, they were drawn to the sound of a commotion. They saw guards violently beating someone and ordering them to leave the area or face death. Philip felt disgusted and disturbed by the sight, especially as the victim appeared to be a young child, while Simon's mind wandered to other thoughts. He noted how, despite the drastic changes the world had undergone over the past 500 years, its darker aspects remained unchanged. Simon believed that the longer these aspects persisted, the more corrupt and rotten they became. Anger flared within Simon as he witnessed the scene, prompting him to intervene. He called out to the guards in a terrifying tone, commanding them to stop immediately. At the same moment, another voice addressed the guards, causing them to search for its source, surprised by the audacity of being spoken to in such a manner. A girl appeared from behind Simon and Philip, criticizing the guards and stating that as royal guards, their duty was to protect the people and the kingdom's citizens. She questioned why they were using violence and intimidation against children, and emphasized that nobles were not the only ones deserving of protection. Simon turned to see who the bold girl was and was utterly stunned, unable to believe his eyes. The girl continued speaking passionately, declaring that poor children had the same right to protection as noble children. But Simon's thoughts were consumed by something entirely different. The girl was an exact replica of Katerina.